My name is Ellen Bolin. I'm a senior advisor with the Secretary of Natural Resources here in the Commonwealth. The Secretary is the office that is leading this broader effort in Virginia on improving coastal resilience and how we're going to deal with this moving forward. Hello to everybody in the room. Hello to everybody on Zoom. Couple of housekeeping notes. If you are in the room, please keep your mask on. And then in Zoom, when it comes to the question and answer period, what we're going to have you all try to do is put your answers and your questions in chat. We are in a pretty good sized room here. We wanted to provide that to take appropriate COVID precautions. So we are working through some of the technological changes, but really thankful for everybody who is here in the room and who has signed on to join us tonight to talk about this important issue. Okay, well, my presentation isn't advancing. Let's try this. There we go. So just a brief overview of where we're going. Talking about the Coastal Master Resilience Plan. So the first thing we're going to talk about is what is coastal resilience and what does this look like for the community of Portsmouth moving forward? But the bulk of the conversation tonight that I would like to have as a conversation is what are the community needs here? How is flooding impacting your daily lives? So as I go through the first part of this presentation, I really encourage you to think about answers to questions like, does flooding change your ability to get to work? Do you have to change your route to work? Do you have to change your route to school or to get groceries? Sort of how does it affect your day-to-day life and what we can learn about that? And then the last thing is we're going to go into next steps. So what are some short, medium, and long-term solutions to addressing coastal resiliency issues in the Commonwealth? So first step, what is coastal resilience? I'm just going to pause for a second because I find it's helpful just to read this definition. So the thing I want to focus on in this definition is anticipate, prepare for, and respond to. And those are the three things we're going to focus on tonight around coastal resilience is how do we really anticipate what is coming, how it's going to impact our communities, how do we prepare for it, most importantly, and how do we respond to it when it occurs? So coastal flood hazards. What is a coastal flood hazard? It's a term we use a lot, but I think it's really important to break down the pieces. And these are things that a lot of you know. So tidal flooding is also often called nuisance flooding. This is what you see probably most often. It's when you get a really high tide, flood some streets, often doesn't last that long. Storm surge flooding. This is a big one. This is often what happens when we have a coastal storm come ashore, a hurricane, tropical storm, that thing can really drive water into land. It's particularly devastating when it's a high tide, like was one of the side effects of Isabel, occurred during a high tide. And rainfall flooding. And rainfall flooding can also be pretty catastrophic. This is how when you get a lot of water in a very short amount of time and that water has no place to go. So it goes through the fastest path, which is often hardened surfaces, streets, neighborhoods, etc. So the challenge today, this is really to start painting the picture for Virginia more broadly. 70% of people live in coastal areas at risk of flooding, and it causes pretty significant economic damage. And this was just for 18 and 19, that we had $1.6 billion in major floods. And also, Virginia has the highest level of sea level rise on the East Coast, highest rate of sea level rise on the East Coast. So water is coming, and water is actually increasing faster than we thought when it comes to tidal issues. So what's driving increased flooding? A couple of different things. One of the things I mentioned, rising seas due to climate change. This will increase sort of the initial level of high tides. We'll have higher low tides, just be dealing with water. Sinking land, which gives the water more places to run to. Changing weather patterns and severe storms. So this means we are likely going to see storms more frequently and severe storms more frequently. And then construction. This has two impacts. One, it can put more people in the way of water than before, and it can also create hardened surfaces, which gets back to that those flash floods and that rainfall flooding that I talked about can have those impacts. So let's talk about Portsmouth though, because we are here today in Portsmouth and really wanted to focus in on what the impacts are to this community. A lot of information up here and I'm going to walk you through it. So focusing on the 2020 map, the red lines are the major roads. Just to give you a sense of where we are. The arrow is literally where we are. That's at Tidewater Community College today, to give you a sense of this. And this is what flooding looks like today. So if you look at the dark blue areas right here, pretty sure you can see my cursor, These are mean low water and mean high water events. So the usual water events, the usual tides, and then working all the way into these paler areas, this is what we refer to as a 500-year flood event, an event we expect to only occur every 500 years, and it is catastrophic. So from the light blue to the dark blue to the light green, that's sort of everything in between in terms of what we think about for storm events. Now, as we talk about coastal flooding, one of the things you may have heard more recently is they're increasingly referring to things as a 100-year storm. So we had a 100-year storm one year, and then we had a 100-year storm the next year. And that is because we are seeing these events are increasing in terms of occurrence. So 2060, I think it's worth noting that 2020, where we are today, Tidewater Community College, is not really in the mix when it comes to coastal flooding, even for a 500-year flood event. And that changes quite a bit in 2060. So in the next 40 years, we expect that these areas will begin to experience dealing with water. So a lot of information up here, but the really key takeaway as we talk about this is that we have more people dealing with more water more often. That's the key challenge we have. So this is just a different way to look at this. Black again is roads, the red is the "you are here" arrow, very helpful. This is really showing community resources. So this is the density of community resources, homes, businesses, local government. And the darker the square, the more likely that they are going to be impacted by a coastal flood hazard. So again, it's interesting to look at where we are. 2020, not that bad. 2060, it is more people experiencing more water, experiencing it more often. So we can talk about the numbers for a minute. In the next 40 years, coastal flooding may impact, 36,000 more people, 17,000 roughly more buildings, and 7,000 more acres of land. Now, 7,000 more acres of land is kind of hard to imagine. So think about this. Naval Station Norfolk is 3,500 acres. So twice Naval Station Norfolk in 40 years will experience flooding. But I also wanted to take a moment right here to acknowledge that it is easy to reduce flooding impacts to statistics. It is easy to reduce it to people and buildings and acres. But as we talk here tonight, there are hundreds of thousands of people that are dealing with the impacts of coastal flooding. Communities from Louisiana to communities in Tennessee to communities from Maryland to New York right now are dealing with the impacts, often catastrophic, often fatal, of coastal flooding. And so I wanted to acknowledge that oftentimes we can get caught up in the numbers and the acreage, but at the end of the day, this is a people problem and people are affected. So I also just wanted to take a minute to think of those communities tonight, what they're going through. So this is the fun part of the conversation for us, really why I hope you all are here today. It is a chance to talk about what are your community needs. And so what this looks like for the next couple of slides, we're gonna have 3 sets of questions. So we're gonna start here, and we're gonna ask initially people in the audience that are present here, and then we're gonna go to questions on Zoom. Miriam Karad, who's also here in our office, is going to tee those up. And this is really a chance to talk about what is causing issues in your community. So the first question I really want to talk about is what causes floods here? And what does that look like? Because flooding can look like a lot of different issues. It's the raging rivers. Sometimes it's just standing water that hasn't gone away for a couple of weeks. So the floor is open now. This is the response sort of part of the presentation where we'd really like to hear from you in terms of what flooding looks like in your neighborhood. So we want input from you all. Yes. And I will try to, for people on the Zoom, I will try to repeat these responses to help get it. These will also all be recorded. Okay, so the response was flooded yard due to lack of drainage, that is an ongoing issue. Is that, how frequent is that?
When we have more than 3.
Okay, so it was when they have more than 3 inches of rain at a time.
Stormwater infrastructure is not adequate to handle.
Okay, the stormwater infrastructure is not adequate to handle it. What other issues from people in the room? I'll even take a further step back then. What caused people to come here tonight? Oh, here we go, we've got someone. So blocked drainage in the streets is what's causing some flooding issues. Okay. Anybody else having that problem? We can go to show of hands. I got 3, 4 hands in the audience. What else? Yes.
That would keep the river when the tide is there. Floodgate frozen. We have had water in that house. So really, it's like number of yards we are.
Okay.
That's needed.
Okay. So this is flooding and the removal of floodgates because there was issues with those. Who else is experiencing flooding on a monthly basis?
Oversight of drainage.
Okay.
General Assembly says they do for special requirements. Your building is small.
So this is oversight on construction and drainage plans, sort of what's happening there. What's most at risk in this community when it floods? What are some of the things that flood that you're worried about, either in sort of rainy day flooding or just more broadly for a category, small category hurricane, big storms? Okay. So access to critical services, that's a concern when it floods the streets here. Yeah, in the back, I saw a hand go up. Yeah.
When it rains, ditch on one side of the road and no ditch on the other side of the road. And another thing is, it's really constructive. But the road is here. The land is here. They haven't learned to have what's called downward guide into this. One side, and then there's no ditch on the other. So it's a lack of taking care of our money that we pay each month for stormwater drainage.
Okay, so design and stormwater drainage. We've heard that from many different communities initially. Miriam, do we have, Miriam, to see if we've got some questions or comments in the chat on Zoom?
Yeah, we've got a response. Hopefully you can hear me. A response in the chat in Craddock. Thank you. We have storm flooding that makes roadways impassable, not so much in yards. Our streets are old and have many sinkholes and bad pitch. Our storm water system is inadequate. 2 weeks ago, with the large storm, we had a lot of water in the neighborhood, major roadways impact. The only thing saving my neighborhood from flooding is the wetlands. They need to be protected.
So in case people in Zoom can also hear that, raising issues about flooding, how it's impacting the roads, and also raising, for the first time we've heard tonight, this idea of natural barriers and things that can protect us. So wetlands, living shorelines, oyster reefs that can help deal with storm surge. It's a pretty important role that nature has to play in helping us deal with this problem. Miriam, other comments or questions from Zoom?
That's it at this time.
Okay. Gary.
Well, yeah, but we know in general, I think what we're talking about is our quality of life. Some streets that I've observed repeatedly flood. It's almost predictable that on certain streets that heavy rain, water is about 3 to 4 to 5 feet away from the curb, stays there for days. It's all just this lack of maintenance of that curbside canal.
Okay.
Or the fact that not present. So those back to early design.
So that's talking about street design and whether or not even from the beginning, there was adequate drainage built for that community or built for that area, and that it's impacting quality of life and the ability to navigate different places. So yes. Mhm.
Much of Portsmouth was filled land, downtown and low-lying areas. Now 60 and 70 years later, the wetlands are reclaiming their land, and we've got no real way to that, how to design around thinking spot.
Okay. And that was something we talked about early on in terms of one of the causes of was land subsidence. And so she was talking about wetlands and the fact that a lot of Portsmouth is built on fill and built on low-lying levels. So 60, 70 years ago. So I'm curious for people in this room, has your home ever been affected by flooding? We'll do this with show of hands. Sort of who's had that? Got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. About half the people have been affected by flooding in this room. Okay. Any other thoughts in terms of what causes flooding or what flooding looks like in your neighborhoods before we move on? Yes, first in the front and then right behind.
When they illegally, don't worry, we'll make them bring them back. No trees.
Okay.
It's still, it would do have some curb and gutter now because they're getting, but there is no rain. There's no, there's up there that water. They violate. And now they stacked up dirt eventually, but it's 6 feet above my bed.
Okay.
Guess what? My yard's got water.
Okay.
So the city has had a blind eye testing, and they have given carte blanche to it.
Okay.
These are policy.
Okay. So what we're hearing from people in the audience is this is a policy problem regarding buildings and how those are permitted and how those permits are enforced in terms of environmental regulations. Yeah.
We mess about water in your home,
Mhm.
but there's water in cars.
Mm-hmm.
And all
Mhm.
but it's like up to your door.
Okay.
Because it's high tide, it's safe, right? But
So also hearing that it's not just homes, it's cars and the ability to access your home that can cause a problem if there's standing water in parking lots. We've got a question in the chat or a comment in the chat I'd like to capture.
Yes. So several folks have said yes, and specific comment regarding the foundation and crawl space under the water.
Okay, so foundations and crawl spaces underwater, so even if it may not be in your living space, you're still dealing with it, can still have long-term impacts on your house. All right, I think I'm going to shift to, I think where we are actually headed is how does flooding impact you? So I heard that, even if it's not in your house, it can affect your ability to get in and out of your house, it can affect your car, it can affect your roads. So how does flooding affect you? Does it cause you to have to change your routes to work? What are some of those things that's affecting you regarding flooding, different kinds of flooding? Yeah.
Yes. I worked in South Chesapeake. flooding event. Had to report 4 different things to get on to get to 60. Oh, no, I couldn't get on. Okay.
Okay. So what we're hearing is just the ability to have to navigate multiple routes out of your neighborhood to get to the highways. And that requires a pretty in-depth knowledge of where you are, which can provide a challenge to people who may move here and who are new here. And that's not something that I'm hearing that there's really a resource initially be able to track, because you can't go on Google Maps and sort of say where in my neighborhood is flooded today. You've got a little bit of trial and error on that, which can add travel times and can create issues. It can also create issues for first responders being able to come into those areas. Other thoughts about how flooding? Oh, Miriam, sorry, in the chat. Okay.
Read out. Commuting is a nightmare.
Is that flood related or not flood related? Just to be clear. Okay.
As well as transportation and health and access to healthcare and
Okay. So I think in addition to, as I hear laughter, right, commuting and traffic is a challenge in Hampton Roads, to put it mildly. I'm sure we all had to deal with some of that tonight. But then you add flooding and you cut off routes, and that's going to exacerbate what is already an existing problem. Adding time to people's commutes, adding time to first responders, just overall making things more difficult at the time. So that's helpful in terms of access and healthcare. Other thoughts about how flooding is impacting you? The thing I will also offer is, and we will get to this at the end, is if you are thinking through these questions, right, because this is new, and you have additional thoughts, we will have an email address for you at the end. So if you think of something like, oh, flooding impacts me here, or I'd like for you to know this, you will have another opportunity, hopefully multiple opportunities, to talk to us and tell us what is going on. Hand in the back. Okay, hearing it's impacting school bus routes and kids' ability to be able to be picked up or dropped off, which is a problem. Anything else? Think about it. Miriam, anything in chat?
nothing.
Okay. Oh, sorry, Gary, I'm so sorry.
What about housing? What about food? What about a job? Now, simply
Yeah, so what remember the honest Gary was saying, and this is something I should have better addressed, is like also there's a pretty big concern, as there should be, for communities that have historically been excluded from these conversations and have historically been under-resourced in responding to them. And how do we ensure that there's an equitable approach to coastal resilience, and how do we make sure those voices are heard? And that is actually one of the goals of this meeting and future meetings we will have, and we will talk about those next meetings, is making sure that voices that typically are not at the table are at the table. And that's a pretty critical part of this coastal master plan resilience work. So thank you. Hand up in the front. Okay. So adding on to issues in terms of historically excluded or underserved communities, under-resourced communities, is the impacts of flooding. So if it's ongoing and you're constantly dealing with water, that can cause mold and growth and have severe impacts on particularly children's health in terms of asthma. So the question is, how do we prevent that moving forward? And also probably how do we address that problem now? It's ongoing. Yep, we got a question in chat.
So the comment is especially important in the region is lack of access to major military installations like the hospital and high and the Coast Guard.
Okay, I hear this question on Zoom, and I'm actually going to ask a clarifying question. Is that being able to access those resources? So if it's the resources you depend on, commissary exchange, healthcare, is it the ability to get to work? It's a significant employer in this region. And I think it's important to actually understand both. Both are very important, but understanding is it resources or jobs that are really driving that. Any thoughts? So the last thing I want to talk about and really like to hear from people is how do we prepare and how do we respond? And as I mentioned earlier, this is pretty timely, unfortunately. And I think it's really important as a community that we are prepared and we help our neighbors be prepared. So I think one of the questions I have is for people in this room and for people on Zoom, I may just do a show of hands. How many people get their information from the local news in terms of weather? I got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 3 on the internet. All right. How many people rely on social media when it comes to information on storms and events like that? Twitter, Facebook. I got one in the back. Relying on social media. So where do you get your information from when it comes to flooding? Is it things like the National Weather Service's webpage? Is that NOAA? How many people rely on NOAA for their information? Right. Right, because we heard when cable's out, and that brings the question of reliable internet and electricity of how you can access this information. Also the thing is in a case of a flood emergency, are you able to evacuate? Do you evacuate? How many people here have had to evacuate for a storm? How many people were told to evacuate and didn't? Yeah. Right. I just remember during Matthew, there was some zone A evacuations and there were definitely people that stayed. And there's multiple barriers to evacuation. I think that's important to remember, is sometimes it is a choice to stay there and sometimes it is not. It is because you lack the resources to be able to leave. And I think that's really important to understand for those communities. What are the barriers to being able to get out of the way of a storm? It's something we need to focus on. Do you know where to go if you evacuate? Do you guys have a place to go if you have to evacuate for a major storm? Depends upon the path of the storm forecasted. That's an excellent point. I got one coming on Zoom.
Yeah, I think you've got a couple just
Okay.
notes. I'll just read a few. One of which was just talking about weather.com as a resource, also an app. Folks that use apps on their phone to get weather news. And then just a note about somebody being had an experience of evacuation. I only evacuated for a storm during Hurricane Katrina when we were out of power for 3 days.
Okay. So initially not evacuating, but then having to evacuate, which is a major challenge and problem, because oftentimes if you get to the point where you absolutely have to evacuate, things have gotten pretty dire. It also makes it pretty hard on first responders and people who are coming in. So they don't make the call to evacuate lightly, but it is important that when it is called, we pay attention. All right, other thoughts in terms of evacuations or issues before I get into a little bit more about preparedness? Yeah, one in front and then behind. I can't read name tags from here. Okay, if the tunnel gates aren't operational, nobody's going anywhere. So excellent point. We rely on infrastructure to be able to get us in and out of areas, particularly out, and that's important. In the back?
So one of the difficulties I have was poor planning on the part of people who built balance and lack of acceptance of mitigating the expenses. The real challenge is zero to the concept. We don't viable, we don't tend to be of the emergency. I know is that there will be an excess short time. I would respond differently. Occasional thunderstorms, chance of heavy rainfall.
Okay, so we're hearing there's insufficient data on the frequency and the amount of rainfall that may occur, and that may shape people's actions, right? 3 inches of rain in an hour versus 3 inches of rain over 3 days is going to be a very different reaction and very different levels of preparedness. So how do we get better information or communicate better information around rainfall issues? So I'm also curious, and this is for people who feel comfortable answering this question, so that's a caveat. For people who didn't evacuate and there was a call to evacuate, show of hands, completely anonymous, was the reason because you thought you sort of could ride out the storm, right? Is it hesitancy to leave because you think things are going to be okay? Sort of curious how that shapes people's opinions, because that's one of the things that we're seeing as we talk about evacuation and building phrases a weather-ready nation is when they call for evacuation, how do you communicate why that evacuation is important and understanding why people don't. Something to think about in terms of, if you'd like to share that later, would love to better understand some of the reasons people choose to evacuate or not. I got one in the back. Okay. 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 So we hear people, and this is not uncommon. This is not unique to Virginia, other communities. This is an issue with wanting to stay, thinking you can write it out. That's common. And there are other set of challenges there as well. So what happens? Did I see someone? What happens if a storm is coming? So this is something that I actually recently added to our conversation and is very critical to our conversation today. Again, particularly given the events that are happening around the country. So there's some numbers on this slide that I want you to pay attention to because in the phrase they use sort of with NOAA is turn around, don't drown, which is a really clever phrase. I think it resonates. But what does that mean and what does that look like? So 6 inches of fast moving water can take down an adult, not a child, an adult. 12 inches of fast moving water, so a foot, can take out a small car, and 18 inches to 24 can carry away most SUVs, vans, and trucks. And oftentimes the impacts are devastating. So if you come to a road that is flooded and you don't know how deep that water is, turn around. If you take away one of a few things from this conversation today, it's that please turn around. Flooding is real and it has very real impacts. And we are seeing that throughout the country today. The next thing is be prepared and know your zone. So this is an actual screenshot from the Virginia Department of Emergency Management. The blue area right here, give or take, is where we are. put our address in right here. And this shows that we're in zone C. So probably unlikely to evacuate except for a pretty significant storm, but it's helpful to know when they're talking about different zone evacuations, where do you fall? And this information is available right on Virginia Department of Emergency Management's webpage. You can plug in your address, you can plug in other people's addresses for fun. But this is really important to know where you are. So when you get the information, you can know how it affects you. The last thing is to be prepared and have a plan. I could probably spend an hour talking about what a hurricane preparedness plan looks like, but won't. But this guide right here is the Virginia Hurricane Evacuation Guide, particularly navigating this during the ongoing pandemic. And so we actually have these at the back of the room. It looks like this, and this is going to lay out all of the things you need. Delcino's waving it in the back. Thank you. This is going to lay out what do you need in terms of an emergency kit? What numbers do you need? Where's your critical information and different things like that. So this is an excellent resource. We have them available. We will also have the link available on our master plan webpage, as well as under the invitation for this meeting if you need to access it. But highly recommend. We are not out of the woods on hurricane season yet. So encourage people to be prepared and ready. So be prepared, get engaged. What does that look like? So one of the things that we have to provide resources to communities, particularly historically excluded or under-resourced communities, is a community flood fund. This is funded with money from the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, and part of the fund is geared towards providing capacity for communities to figure out what their flooding problems are, which is the first step. We have some communities that in localities that know what their needs are, but a lot of other communities don't have that and they don't have the resources yet. So if you have thoughts on coastal flooding or any kind of flooding, if you have thoughts on solutions, talk to your localities, talk to your elected leaders. They can apply for this money and they can bring resources into this community to address the flooding problems. So it's the Community Flood Fund. There's also information on our webpage we can talk about. This is flagging that there are resources there, particularly if you engage with your local leaders and tell them this is important to you, they should apply for the funding. So one of the things that is driving all of this that I mentioned early on is this Coastal Master Resilience Plan. And this is an effort to bring together all of the coastal resilience challenges across Virginia and help address some of those concerns. So many localities may not be able to afford to create an individual plan. No locality can afford to pay for all of the projects. And at times, local plans may not consider impacts to other localities. So what may work for here may actually cause detrimental impacts to the community next to you. And so we want to understand, take a comprehensive and holistic view of what does coastal resiliency look like in Virginia. And that's where the Commonwealth comes in. That's the need for the Coastal Master Plan to identify and address both the shared challenges that all coastal residents are facing and challenges that may be unique to certain areas or certain parts of the population. State government also has the ability to be able to coordinate across localities and regions and planning district commissions and federal efforts in terms of identifying adaptation and resilient strategy. And we also want to ensure that with this, that we leave no community behind, that we are addressing the needs of everyone, that it is equitably and addressing some of the longstanding issues that have been occurring. And so this is the ongoing effort for what we're trying to do. And so we'll take information from this community meeting. There are 8 more community meetings can be found on the Commonwealth schedule. The next one is in Norfolk on September 7th. And then we have, looks like Gloucester on September 16th, Newport News on the 20th, Hampton on the 21st, Chesapeake on the 22nd. So strongly urge you to reach out to people that you know, particularly in those communities, tell them to come, tell them to share. We do recognize that we are still in the middle of a global pandemic, and that's why we provide the Zoom option. There will be an all virtual option at the end of these meetings for people that may not be able to make it for whatever reason. So we want to ensure that this information is accessible to everybody, during these times. Yes. Okay.
If I may, I just want to also mention that there are a number of folks that will also choose to call in. There's also a call-in information or call-in number. And although we're able to take their comments, certainly feel free to call in the call-in number for all these meetings. Additionally, all of the areas that we are going to be meeting at with the APA.
Okay, so for those of you on Zoom who may not have heard it, there's call-in information for all these meetings. These meetings are ADA accessible. Also, if you need an interpreter, I believe with the 72-hour notice, we can also provide that. We want to ensure that people who need this information can access this information. And if you have thoughts on how we're not meeting that, let us know. That's really important to us that we provide these resources. And these are being recorded for those who can't be here. I saw a hand up in the back. Yes. Uh-huh. Yep, we can we can definitely do that. So I'm going to wrap this slide and then we can ask whatever remaining questions people have. That's a really good point. All right. So the other thing is, so be prepared, stay engaged, right? Talk to your localities, follow us for the Coastal Master Plan. These are all good resources to follow. So Virginia Department of Emergency Management on social media, so Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Really good way to get pretty good up-to-date information in terms of what is happening. They also have a lot of resources in terms of how to be prepared for the storms. So highly recommend that. Incredible oversight here on my part. The National Weather Service is definitely something, and NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, is obviously the major resource on this. Not sure how I missed that option, but definitely follow NOAA. There are weather field offices for your region. So in addition to following sort of big NOAA or even the National Weather Service, there is even a local office that's going to better address your immediate questions around that. And then Secretary of Natural Resources, you can follow us on Twitter and on our webpage, which will be the next link, for updates on the plan and what we're doing. It's also a couple of different options to offer feedback. We have a public survey that is going to continue to be open that you can fill out and provide more information to us on what flooding looks like. And then the Department of Conservation and Recreation, and I should have mentioned that Daryl, my colleague, is here. If he'll stand up, wave his hand. Department of Conservation and Recreation is a significant partner in this effort and is really leading the way in addition to the Secretary's office on this effort. So they will also be a good resource. So lastly, this is the website if you want to learn more about coastal resilience. This is that email I mentioned. If you have additional thoughts or questions or comments, things we missed, and really appreciate everybody coming out tonight and on Zoom. And now, so the floor is open. If you have additional questions or comments, I would love to hear them. Yes. I'm with the Secretary of Natural Resources. The question was, what department am I with? So we also have Zoom, so that's why I'm repeating some of the comments so they can hear online as well. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay.
And I went to the city council, I don't care who said it. And complain. And nobody, they will always say. And
Mhm.
I'm dishonest, and check the videos and pictures. So that it shows that everything is fine.
Mhm. Mhm. Okay. Mhm. 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 So I think this is an important. Okay. Okay. Mhm. Okay. So I want to repeat this question because I want to make sure it's captured, and I will not be able to remotely capture what you said. So I would like to talk to you later. The question is, what happens when we fail to respond to people who have been impacted by flooding? And that's this, and catastrophically, and whether, and if at the federal level, at the state level, at the local level, how do we respond to people who are still living with the impacts of flooding and mold and structural damage years later? And ma'am, I wish I had an answer for you. And yeah, so I thank you for that. And I think that Gary's got his hand up.
And their food benefits, they, the Department of FEMA updated set of disaster policy, advanced equity for disaster providers. For the key change, extending the full documentation, provide solutions for hope and hope. This tells me that FEMA is
So what we heard from someone in the audience is that sounds like FEMA is actually trying to update their guidance and their guidelines on how they get information from people to address some of this. And that came out today or recently. So, and the other thing that I heard that I think is worth repeating as well is oftentimes for people who have been impacted, there's a bunch of different forms to fill out from a bunch of different people. Oftentimes it can be contradictory. And so how do we begin to address that problem and how can we look at what response looks like? Yes.
I would like to question, since you're doing this presentation, how are you affecting the city to do their responsibility in maintaining? What do y'all do to help the city do their responsibility?
So the question is, what do we do here to help the city address their drainage and address their problem? One of the things that we have done in terms of city engagement is we did host a different set of meetings talking to the cities through the PDCs, the planning commissions, to identify what some of those areas were. But that is a question I actually need to get a better answer to, because I don't want to make something up and I need to better understand the resources we are providing to the cities. And it may be through different state agencies. But right now with this effort, one of the things we're really trying hard to do is to figure out where those gaps are. Where are the gaps and where are the cities and localities failing to provide resources for whatever reason. So we're trying to understand the problem at the moment is the bulk of our effort. And I will definitely figure out and see, sort of better understand what we are doing there. I won't.
Also talk about
I did that. I mean, yeah, I mean,
as part of that.
yes. So Miriam's reminding me that the Community Flood Preparedness Fund is something else that we are doing. Oops, back here. And this is the fund that I mentioned to talk to people, to your localities, to apply for that funding, that can help, that will bring resources into communities that need it. Part of that money is specifically directed towards historically excluded communities and under-resourced communities. I believe it's 25% of that money is directed towards that. Minimum of 25%. And I've also got someone, so Daryl's in the back, he's from the Department of Conservation and Recreation. I think he's going to add on to answer these questions. So one of the things we do have tonight for people in the room, we're trying to figure out how to offer this resource via Zoom, is that we have maps in the back. We have maps of Portsmouth and we have Sharpies, and we would love for you to go back and write on it, where is this occurring? Where, like, to help us better understand what this flooding looks like. So there's 2 maps and a bunch of Sharpies. And I think that's a great place to start in terms of helping us capture that information. I saw another hand up front. Yeah. That is the Department of Conservation and Recreation. Mm-hmm. DCR. We're looking at right.
we have our own grant.
So the question, so Daryl from Department of Conservation and Recreation with the state is answering questions about the Community Preparedness Fund and repeating that this money is for localities to be able to increase resilience and capacity in those communities. And so for people who are looking for information on it, there is information on DCR's website if you circle it, but really it's engaging with your localities and encouraging them to apply for it. It's really going to be the best avenue to do that from. Okay, we're hearing that. Okay, we're hearing that sometimes even when localities apply for the money, it may not be applied in the areas that need it. All right, really appreciate you all taking the time to be here tonight, both in on Zoom and in person. And thank you all for engaging in this process and helping us with it. Again, for those of you who are in the room, we have maps in the back and would love to get your input on where flooding is occurring, what kinds of flooding. And this is one of the ways to stay in touch with us, at least on the broader master plan and what is being done. And then as always, sort of the parting message, encouraging you all to be prepared for coastal flooding, turn around if there's water, know your zone, and ensure you have a hurricane preparedness kit. Thank you all tonight. Appreciate your help.